Hey, welcome back to Real Food Mental Health. My name is Cody Cox. Today's episode it has a more of a conventional spin on it because I'm interviewing Mendi Baron. He is a licensed clinical social worker, and I like to put some conventional things in my show once in a while because I do think it's important to keep those in mind as we compare to more holistic or functional approaches to mental health. And sometimes these conventional approaches actually have some some really good value to them. And so Mendi will speak to that in today's episode. A little bit more about him. He is the founder and CEO of several treatment centers, including Mariah Behavioral Health, Ignite Teen Treatment, Elemental Treatment, Eden Center for Eating Disorders, Hope Street, and Brightway Behavioral Health. Clinically trained, Mendi has extensive experience as a therapist in both individual and group counseling programs. He's a well known expert spokesperson in the field of mental health and addiction, and he's even appeared on the Dr. Phil show and is a frequent guest expert on local Las Vegas news programs and also NPR. Today's episode is going to be a little bit more conventional because it is a licensed therapist. But if you would like to get started on a more holistic journey to better mental health and honestly better physical health, then you might be interested in starting one of my nutrition programs. Particularly if you want to save some money, you can start with my small group nutrition program called Restart. It is offered online, and the nice thing about nutrition is I can offer this to pretty much most people in most states and countries. So head over to beavercreekwellness.com/restart to read more about it and to choose a start date. Welcome to the Real Food Mental Health Podcast, where we explore the powerful connection between mental and physical health. My name is Cody Cox, a holistic nutritional psychotherapist, and I'm here to guide you on a journey to true wellness, mind, body, and spirit. If you're tired of quick fixes and want real solutions that address the root cause, you're in the right place. Let's get started on your path to lasting wellness. Welcome back to Real Food Mental Health with Cody Cox. Today I have Mendi Baron. Mendi, why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. So I am a LCSW. I'm a psychotherapist. I specialize primarily in working with children, teens, young adults, and their families, kind of a developing age, if you will. I have a private practice, and I also operate a larger company that services teens.
Okay, and you've got different companies in different states, right? So
Yes,
if I remember right, it's a residential facility in Las Vegas.
correct. We have
Is that
residential
correct?
facilities in Las Vegas. Yep,
And then you've got in Maryland a private practice and
correct. Private practice primarily.
so. Oh, okay. Okay, gotcha. Now, let's talk a little bit about your residential facility. So, is that just for teens, young adults? Is there a particular focus for that?
Yeah, so we specialize in working with teens. Teens are a particularly challenging population, right? Teenagers know everything, um, but at the same time, it's a very rewarding sort of process because you can really see the change that you make with younger people. You can shift them and see the shift. And so we primarily focus on mental health, some addiction, and as a secondary concern, we can deal with some disordered eating processes. And we do work with the nutritional team alongside our staff. So it's sort of a combo we try to address as much as we can.
And is there a particular reason you chose Las Vegas to establish that practice?
Oh, that's a longer story, but I had built and operated quite a few facilities for other people in California where I lived, and Las Vegas looked to be an untapped location, and it really is. They have very few resources as it pertains to this. So I said, okay, it's a new frontier. 31-minute flight from LA.
Yeah.
Let's give this a shot.
And yeah, I've actually made that flight before a few times. I was practicing in southern Utah. I'm now in northern Utah, But
Got
in
it.
southern Utah, we have a lot of wilderness therapy programs.
Yes.
And so essentially it's residential, but it's outside, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like there's always like a particular reason why a residential facility is in it, its current location. So southern Utah just is it's just kind of the wilderness therapy area as far as like lots of national forest, national parks. They don't really go into the national parks for treatment, but a lot of ideal landscapes for being outside in a therapeutic setting.
There's a secondary reason for that also.
Yeah, tell me about that.
So in Utah, due to some religious exceptions, you're allowed to run therapeutic boarding schools that are locked. You can't lock a teenager into any location anywhere in the country except for Utah, or for your hospital. And because of that, those programs operate there and they work in partnership with the wilderness programs. So it makes sense. They go to wilderness program and then from there they transition to one of the therapeutic boarding schools. So that's also sort of a common behind the scenes feature.
Ah, see, I did not know that. I grew up in Utah. I mean, I went to school in Arizona, but I've been practicing in Utah since I became a therapist. And I just figured it was kind of the same in most states, but I just thought it was more of the outdoor landscape, which is why they chose Utah for
Yeah.
most of the wilderness therapy programs. How does your program differ from wilderness therapy? Is there a like particular angle that you're taking with it as far as like therapeutic modalities or anything like that?
Sure. I mean, so wilderness programs are primarily designed as a high intensity intervention for a short period of time. They're also primarily indicated for kids who have really intense behavioral struggles, right? So going out into the wilderness gives you a chance to kind of work through some of that stuff. Um, they do not, they don't meet the clinical qualifications for residential program. It's not 24/7 staffed by clinicians and doctors and nurses. It's primarily a therapist and then some wilderness experts. And now some of them have a psychiatrist who will either travel with them or meet them at base camp. But they're designed really to kind of let kids get some stuff out of their system versus really implement truly scientifically backed therapeutic interventions. Um, and because of that, that's the reason they can't bill insurance and other things. They just unfortunately don't qualify like that. So our program is a true residential program, meaning from there, or sometimes in replacement of that, they'll come to actual homes. These are licensed homes. These are accredited homes, staffed 24/7, nurses, psychiatrists, therapists, physical coaches, nutrition. So it's a really robust, round the clock, licensed psychiatric residential treatment center. And so it differs in almost almost every way from a wilderness program. But those programs certainly do have their benefits. And the other piece is we take insurance, and
Hmm.
um, because those programs and also the boarding schools aren't considered um, licensed therapeutic locations, they can't bill insurance for that. So we become a little bit more affordable than some of those programs. Like a wilderness program, you'll pay 25K
Yeah.
for 3 weeks. Boarding schools, you pay 15K a month. But we take insurance. If you have a Blue Shield policy, $500 a month for your policy, and the rest is on us. So it
Oh
becomes
yeah, that is
affordable.
way cheaper.
Yeah, but and when you talk about mental health, as a therapist, right? It's not like oh, you broke your leg, we're going to fix it in 4 weeks and you're on your way, right? Mental health is something that in different varying degrees you're going to deal with for the rest of your life. And even like
Hmm.
diabetes, things can be in check, but you got to be mindful, right? And so parents assume I'm going to spend 25K, and in those 3 weeks it's all going to be fixed. Or in this half a year it's all going to be fixed. But the reality is you need to be able to handle it financially much longer than that. And that's why insurance is a really critical piece of that, because most families can't afford the cash uh, pay version of long-term mental health treatment. That would be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, and I know that's a huge barrier for a lot of people. Like, I mean, there are a lot of people who don't even have insurance despite qualifying for Medicaid or whatever. And that's another hurdle to jump over. But uh, people really need this care and they're not accessing it for whatever reason. I keep hearing that there's a huge shortage of therapists, at least in my state. Are you hearing that where you are too? Like there's a shortage of therapists, and I keep thinking, well, I don't have a full schedule, and I know a lot of
Yeah,
therapists who don't have full schedules. I don't think it's a shortage of therapists. I think it's a shortage of affordability.
I would tend to agree with you. Um, For a couple of reasons. In Las Vegas, we have trouble with getting therapists, not because there aren't enough, because when I'd say again, a lot of therapists get into it with this picture of like the couch and the nice office and writing on your pad and sort of like that, in treatment type show stuff. And so they don't imagine themselves working and billing Medicaid and getting the insurance rates that they may get that are far below what they imagined. And right now in Las Vegas, for example, there are a lot of private practices scooping up all the licensed clinicians, and they're getting pretty decently. So it is actually hard to find therapists. Again, not because there aren't therapists, but because they don't want to do the hard work. They want the simple work. Dealing with teens in a residential setting is not the easiest. Documenting for insurance is not the easiest. Yeah, and when you do typical, obviously you can cut me off whenever you want, but when you're a private practice therapist, a lot of them, it's just talk, right? You sit and talk, and then we use some tissues, and then we talk again, and then we arrange to talk again next week. But they can't actually speak to what they're doing in the session. What actual interventions are you implementing? What is actually going on in the session? What changes are you hoping to gain? What's the homework? And what practical things are you doing? Right? If you were playing soccer, you'd be like, I kicked the ball, I passed it to him, I passed it to him, we had the strategy, we got to the goal, we got one goal, right? They don't do that. It's just like I spoke, we talked, da. But when you bill insurance, you can't do that because they want to know what they're paying for. And so for a private practice therapist, it's a lot harder to work in our kind of setting. Um, and a lot of people just don't want to do it. That's sort of one big piece of it. The second piece is, qualified therapists versus therapists. As we talked about earlier, there could be a lot of therapists, not all qualified. I'm not speaking to your situation. And then the third thing is just purely business skills, right? They don't teach you, like you mentioned, they don't teach you too much about nutrition. They also don't teach you how to build a business. And most therapists don't have any idea how to build a business, how to market themselves, how to connect with resources so that people send them referrals, how to navigate online, none of these things. And so they sort of, again, they open this office, they rent a nice space, they decorate it, they're all psyched, they put the little shingle on the door, and like nobody shows up. So you really do have to, especially nowadays with all the competition and the internet, which is where everyone searches for everything, you really have to learn a little bit about marketing and how to run your business effectively.
You have to stand out among all the other marketing noise. And I'm noticing that. And where I live, we have hundreds of therapists, and it's not a huge community. It's like maybe 100,000 people. I'm in a university town, lots of college students, but we have hundreds of therapists because it's a university town. And this particular university has three different therapy programs. So
Oh,
marriage and
wow.
family therapy, social work, and clinical psychology.
Got it. So they're pumping out their own.
And so, yeah, so we've got new therapists every single semester, and that's making it really difficult. But kind of to backtrack a little bit back to the discussion on residential treatment, I was thinking residential actually has an edge on outpatient therapy because the therapist is more involved in the patient's treatment. Where, like in outpatient therapy, typically it's like 1 hour once per week, but in a residential setting, it kind of depends on the business, but usually it's a much smaller caseload for the therapist, and that therapist is able to check in with that patient or that client pretty frequently. Am I right? Is that kind of how yours runs
Yes,
too?
I liked how you reframed client. I do the same thing. Patients are people who need a fix. They come to a doctor to get fixed. Clients are people who come and you help them help themselves.
Uh-huh.
Right? We're not here to fix people. We're here to help them
Yeah.
work through their own challenges. But you are correct. The disadvantage of being a private practice therapist who sees someone once a week or once every 2 weeks is you have no influence on the external environment. Once they leave your office, that's the extent of your influence. That's also the extent of your data, right?
Hmm.
All you have is self-reporting. I did this week. It was better for me. It was worse for me. But you have no way of knowing. In a residential setting, they're there 24/7. So besides the therapist being able to check in daily, you have staff and observations. So, for example, we have a client. I'm not using any names, obviously. A young woman who came to us with a bipolar with manic features diagnosis, which is pretty intense, right? That means like and with psychotic features, meaning that's pretty intense, right? Psychosis is a serious thing. Bipolar is a serious thing. The client did not believe that this was a good diagnosis. They felt that their parents had told the hospital that they were struggling, and the hospital just threw a diagnosis at them. So this client refused to take medication. Um, Fast forward within a week, the parents are like, we must take medication. He's going to get terrible. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be terrible. It's been 8 weeks and he's fine. There's no symptoms. Um, and we know this because we've observed him, her 24/7. And we can see all the elements that we need to see. And so I actually had a call today with this child's advocate and with their parents. And I said, you guys are pushing for medication, but there's no moral basis for that at this point. The diagnosis is maybe a rule out, but it doesn't stand, at least according to our observations right now. If anything, if it did exist, it's in remission. So again, the ability to see that and not depend on self-reporting from a parent or a kid, and the ability to control the environment, right, is a big deal.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how many times I've had people come back because I do specialize in nutritional psychotherapy. I've had a lot of people come back and they're like, "Oh, I didn't really do any of the homework because I wasn't able to follow up with them between sessions." And
Yeah.
yeah, like I could send like a text message or something, and some therapists do, but then that's time out of my day that I'm not getting paid for. And so in
Sure.
a residential
Also true.
setting, there's definitely a benefit to that, right? So the therapist is still getting paid to follow up and to make sure that these clients are being taken care of.
Correct. And if they're not paid for it, you still have the floor staff.
Yeah, that's true, the support staff. So typically it sounds like you mostly work with teenagers, young adults, and I think you said families too, right?
Yes, families and kids. In my private practice, I actually deal with a lot of school age kids.
What led you to focusing on these younger populations?
I think the idea. I haven't written off adults, okay, but with kids and teens, when you make a change, you get the satisfaction of seeing that change, right? A little change has a much different trajectory for a kid than for an adult. At the same time, kids are super pain, and teenagers know everything, and it's a very hard population to work with. But it gives you a little bit more reward, which is, again, as a therapist, you probably know you don't always get to see the results of what you do. And so being able to see that is very positive and reinforcing.
Hmm. Yeah, and in my experience, I have worked with kids. It didn't really click with me. I think it takes the right therapist.
Sure.
And for some reason it wasn't clicking with me to work with kids, but then also having to communicate with the parents. That's just again, it's just extra work outside of the session that you're not really getting paid for. But then everybody's not really on the same page, and so it can be easier for a lot of therapists to only work with adults because you are only dealing with one person.
Yeah.
But then you're right. I mean, it is hard work to work with kids, but I think that actually has the greatest impact. And that's why I initially wanted to do that, because I was like, that is going to make a huge difference for that person if I can help them early on in life rather than waiting until they already have a lot of complex trauma that's yet to be resolved.
Yeah. Well, the good thing about what you're describing is that you're sticking to where your competencies are, meaning you know where your strengths are. And a lot of people want to be, a jack of all trades, master of none, and treat everything. And sometimes I go by these restaurants and
Hmm.
it's like we serve Chinese pizza, chicken, kebab, fish, burgers, Thai food. It's like, okay, well, you got to pick one or maybe two and kind of roll with that, because you want to be really good and competent at what you do. And there are different populations and different challenges. And I, for instance, couldn't work with the elderly because that's not my population. But a lot of people specialize in that, or chronic conditions, or people who are, near death, so to speak, in hospice. These are really tough populations, or prison, or who knows. But there's a lot of different populations, and therefore a lot of different types of therapists that might fit that.
And since this is a little bit more my wheelhouse, let's go ahead and allude to you. I know how you mentioned nutrition being of importance in your residential center. How do you approach nutrition for mental health?
So, as you already mentioned, when we spoke before the beginning, is that schools don't train you on this as it pertains to psychotherapy, for a variety of reasons. And one of the biggest reasons is because a lot of times people fear the liability of, again, stepping outside their competency, even though when it comes to nutrition, it really should be part of your competency, right? You have to understand all the facets of what someone's dealing with to make an appropriate diagnosis. And more often than not, you can miss out on a diagnosis by not knowing the whole picture, right? Is this kid acting out because X, or is it because of Y, right? Are these headaches coming because of anxiety or because of a nutrition issue, right? Is the lack of functioning due to, them having a severe depression, or is their ability to fight depression hampered by the fact that they're not going to sleep till 3 in the morning? right? There's a lot of elements that play into it. And so when we run a treatment center, we have to be that broadly aware. And so when people come in as part
Mm-hmm.
of our assessment, like you said, bio, psychosocial, we bring those elements in, and we look at that, and we seek to eliminate possible options. And when nutrition becomes an issue of note, we address it. That's obviously besides the fact that we run a very tight nutritious program, right? We're not feeding them franks and blanks, and like we have everything designed by nutritionists. The health is important, what they eat is important, how they eat it is important, with whom they eat it is important,
Mm-hmm.
right? Especially with people who have budding eating disorders, who you're eating with is everything, right? Besides just the food. So we do take that quite seriously.
Yeah, and from my standpoint, how you eat it and who you're eating it with does make a huge difference. I totally agree with you because you have to be in a parasympathetic state for your body to properly digest food. And so I was actually taught that the digestive system starts with the brain. Hopefully you're being mindful with your food. Hopefully you're feeling somewhat calm. And hopefully you have a sense of community. So that would be the
Yeah.
who you're
Mhm.
eating with, right? And you're not eating with
Right.
enemies, because if you are, you're not in a parasympathetic state. And for those who aren't familiar, parasympathetic essentially means that calm, peaceful,
Yeah. And you
digestive
think about
state.
people who eat emotionally, right? That's not coming from the right place. People who are anxious and feel nauseous and can't eat. The brain definitely contributes a huge amount to all of it.
So if you have clients who are, say, they're not eating the right way, how would you address that? Like if they're in a more sympathetic dominance, the fight or flight?
That's a good question. It partially depends on the client, right? You can't force feed anybody. Obviously, we're not talking about extreme eating disorders where that's a very different situation, but where they may need tube feeding. But you can't force feed kids, but you can work to do a couple things. Number one, to support their eating with some measure of reward, which is not ideal. Eating for reward is not ideal, but in some situations, you take the cards you're dealt. Secondarily, through exploration, right? Okay, maybe you don't like this food. Why? Right? What foods might you like? Trying food experiences, right? I even do this in my private practice. I have a kid, he's 6, and he like eats two things and only those two things when I got started. And even though my focus is on behavior in school and parenting, this is a big piece. And so we do food tasting and texture and going through it and trying new things and identifying things that work and then building on that. I just did that this week. We both built forts out of the foods he hates and the food he likes, and we made exchanges. I said, okay, I'm going to take one of them that you hate. I'm going to trade for one that you like. Let's see, give it a shot. Turns out he likes cream cheese. He thought he didn't. Right, like little things like that. But in a residential setting,
Hmm.
you have the ability to do that because you have more staff. You have the ability to modify the menu because you have a chef. Right, you have the ability to offer incentives because you have a round the clock program. Um, and so you really have to work with what you're dealt with. And like you mentioned, people come to our places in crisis, right? This isn't an outpatient setting. And so they are inherently not in that state they need to be. And so part of it is also getting them back to that state through the therapeutic process. And sometimes through a medication regimen. If severe anxiety is preventing you from eating because of a lot of reasons, not the least of which could just be like, I'm nauseous and I don't feel hungry. The right medication regimen to help you with some of those nuances, at least initially. It doesn't mean you have to do it for life, but at least to take you down, take the fire down a notch so you can clear the smoke. Then medication can also help.
Yeah, medication was never really meant to be a lifelong thing, even though it seems to be framed that way, especially psychiatric medication. And I know the research shows that it's way more effective if you're getting therapy while you're taking that medication. The medication is meant to kind of give you a boost so that you can learn the skills and process
Exactly.
the trauma while you're getting that boost. If you want to support this podcast, go to kofi.com/Cody Cox. That's ko-fi.com/Cody Cox. So how about like your clients, do they get a lot of time outside, or like what does that look like as far as like time outside, fresh air, sunshine, exercise?
Good question. I mean, the reason I like the residential setting, and more specifically, we have small residential homes. Right? These are actual homes in actual neighborhoods. When you're sitting down to eat, you're sitting at a table with other people. And the benefit to that is we like the opportunity that we get to model real life, to model what it's going to be like in the home setting, to model how things should be, because this is a real life model with support and with role models. And so, among those things, obviously, exercise is critical. Exercise, sleep, food, three critical elements that have nothing to do with medication and have every impact on the mental health state. And so we have each house has a pool. We have a little gym setting at each house. They go off site to boxing. We do hiking. We take that very seriously as part of what they do. And again, for health, for fitness, for mood regulation, for endorphins, for everything really. Even how to work with other people, camaraderie and teamwork, and so on. So yeah, it's a big piece.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're addressing a lot of things at once, which I think is really the best because it's like I was saying before, we tend to focus more on the psychosocial part of the biopsychosocial, which is only part of the puzzle. And so as you encourage your clients to mingle with each other, they're developing a sense of community, a sense of belonging, maybe a sense of purpose. So I mean there's some spiritual components in there as well, but then more lifestyle things, going outside, cooking meals together or enjoying meals together. So like just different things. And I hope listeners are, as they listen to this, are thinking, well, I'm not going to go to residential treatment, but these are things that I need to be doing too.
That to me is actually a big piece that I work with parents in the outside setting. How many parents have this set up when they go to dinner, right? You go to dinner, you cook the food, and it sits there, and then kid number one rolls in a half hour later. Kid number two is in their room playing. They take the food back to their room. Kid number three is going to eat at midnight whenever they get hungry when they're done gaming. Dad is on the phone. Mom's here. Mom's there. Right? There isn't a formal eating process. And because of that, things fall through the cracks. What your kid is eating, what they're not eating, what they may be struggling with. And so I always tell parents one of the key elements to building structure within your home is, besides bedtimes and other things we can discuss, meal times. At least one meal a day, you should all sit at the table so that you can all eat together. You can see what they're eating. You can make sure everyone's getting what they need. And obviously, the benefits from a psychological perspective is you're spending time together. You're talking. You're going through your day. You're going through what happens. And ironically, it's more of a challenge for the parents to do that than the kids. Like, Dad, Mom, you're going to have to put down your phone. I hate to say this, but put all your phones in a bucket and put the bucket in another room and give yourself 20 minutes. It doesn't have to be an hour-long party. 20 minutes. You don't need to do much more. If it's too much, it's too much. But at least 20 minutes. Who can't carve out? You can carve out 20 minutes to go to the bathroom. So that is a huge piece, like you mentioned. It's a perfect example.
Yeah, and that can be hard for some families. Maybe they don't have a sense of trust between in their relationships, and so for some kids, it might feel like forced family fun, right? And so, what would you recommend for a family like that? Like, where, I mean, maybe the child wouldn't really want to do that. Maybe it is a teenager who's a little bit defiant and they need a little bit more support in developing a stronger relationship before they can eat dinner with their family.
So that's well. Let's start with that's an excellent question. Also, a little bit of a complicated question. So, if you're talking about eating disorders, you would be correct, right? Who you eat with, like we talked about, and how you eat and what you eat is important. And a lot of times, if they don't feel a family has that understanding, and many of their siblings do not have that understanding, and the family does not know how to adequately respond to their concerns or what's really triggering them, what their actual thoughts are in their head as they're eating or not eating. So there it is more complicated, and there you do have to get professional help and people involved to help navigate that. And you have to become very educated. But your general, call it rebellious teen, or just call it teen, um, you know, hanging out with their parents is not the most exciting thing in the world. But at the same time, if you told your teen, "Hey, sorry, my headset just fell out." If you told your teenager, like, "Hey, I'll give you a ride to the movies. It's going to take us 20 minutes to get there," they'll figure out pretty quickly how to sit with you in a van. So it doesn't mean that you have to have long conversations or kumbaya, sing songs, hold hands, or even talk too much. But to be present is just to be present, and to teach them to be present and be mindful with your food and just exist around other people. And if, as a parent, these are certain things you should be pushing. And again, if you have to reward it, okay, reward it. Not a one-to-one correlation, not like here's a meal, here's a dollar, but overall, if you participate, we'll work on X, or we'll get Y, or we'll get Z. That's usually my best recommendation. I don't recommend forcing or kicking down doors or things like that, but you can do certain things like, okay, just understand that after 7 o'clock, the kitchen's closed. You're not going to come in and graze. There's not going to be extra food just sitting around for you. If you don't eat now, then that's it. We're not going to be like making second, third, and fourth meals, and that to some extent helps.
I follow pretty closely autism and its link to nutrition and more like ancestral principles to nutrition. And they say that if you have an autistic child, maybe they're very, very picky with food, but all you have to do is keep putting the food in front of them. They have to be exposed. It's something like a minimum of 15 times before they'll finally start to accept it. They're not going to starve to death. Even if they don't eat for several meals, they're not going to starve to death, and eventually they'll start eating. And so maybe that's all it takes. You just have to be consistent with these family meal times. And I totally agree with you. At least one meal a day. We're so busy. We can't make it 3 meals a day for most of us, but one meal a day, usually that's dinner time for most of us. Just have that. Maybe it's a standing appointment, 6 o'clock every evening. We're going to have our family dinner. And we're not going to go and offer alternatives to the people who are picky. We're not going to offer another meal to the people who aren't able to be home. It's just, this is dinner time and that's
Yeah,
it.
and you're 100% right. And one of the things in dealing with kids is behavioral interventions. If you make adjustments to everything, more adjustments will be requested. If you allow certain things, more things will happen. And it doesn't mean you have to turn into a drill sergeant. You don't say like you must eat now. It's a natural consequence. If you don't eat, the restaurant closes. Right from 6 to 6:20, the restaurant's open. And then the restaurant closes. It's not a punishment, but
Yep.
I'm a mom, I'm a dad. I can't keep cleaning the kitchen. I can't keep cooking food, and that does start to get them to go. Okay, here's the time I eat. For example, as a therapist, you're familiar with doorknob therapy, right? Someone comes to a session, they talk about very little during the session. At the very last minute, as they're walking out, they're like, "Oh, remind me next time to tell you about this time I was attacked." Um, and the whole purpose of keeping a session limited to 45 minutes to an hour is to let them know this is the time. If you're going to talk and you want to open up, it's in this space. It's not going to be afterwards. It's not going to be via text for 6 hours. This is your space. And by conditioning that, it becomes their space. And that is a principle that applies across the board. When it comes to spectrum, you are correct. They are very picky. And not just because of the food itself, but the taste, the texture. These are things that become very problematic, right? It's the that whole piece of it. Um, and that's an example of some of the things like I mentioned I do with kids. Like you have to just keep going at it, right? You got to keep trying, keep trying, keep trying, and slowly navigate it
Mhm.
and come up with clever ways to get them to try things, right? Like I did with the trade-off. He got the candy he wanted. He got to try the cream cheese, right? Now he likes cream cheese because he discovered it, but he didn't want to touch it before. You learn what they don't like about something, right? Squishy tomatoes versus firm tomatoes. There's a big difference, and I'm not even on the spectrum. So you kind of have to learn little elements like that.
And even if your child does not have autism, maybe it's just a picky child. It's the same principles. I mean, and I'm dealing with this with my own children where like I've got one who just doesn't eat a whole lot of what we give her, but the more we offer it to her over time, she eventually starts eating it. I have noticed that. And sometimes it takes a few months or a few years, but eventually they try it. And so if you're a parent and you're having a really hard time getting your children to eat together as a family or just eat healthy food, just be consistent. Keep trying, but do it gently. We're not forcing.
Correct, correct. Parenting is about being consistent. That is the number one thing that parents do not do well. Whether it's rules and implementing them, whether it's, you know, telling your kids do as I say, not as I do, and being inconsistent about your own behaviors, whether it's inconsistency about follow-up, whether you promise things and don't come through on them, whether you don't, consistency is the key to everything. How you do things, if it's done consistently, will result in positive change or whatever change you're looking for, hopefully not a negative change.
I think there is some value in having a routine every day, your morning routine, your bedtime routine, having a set schedule. I do think in some ways it's also limiting on the opposite end of the spectrum, but we need to have some kind of a routine that makes us feel like we know what's happening, we know what we're supposed to be doing, and I think ultimately it ends up being more productive. But then you do need to have that flexibility where sometimes your routine doesn't quite work out. Like maybe you have an appointment in the evening and it gets in the way of your family dinner time. And so everybody just kind of has to fend for themselves that day. That's okay, but just jump right back on that routine as soon as you can. Be as consistent as possible. And it's not going to be perfect, but as consistent as possible.
And as long as it's a change from the norm, right? Obviously, in life things change, but if you're doing it right, then that change is recognized as not the norm.
Yeah. In your residential center, how long is the typical client there
Good question.
on average?
The advantage of our kind of setting is it's driven by acuity, which means as long as they're struggling to some extent, they will qualify for continued care through the insurance company. On average, that ends up being around 90 to 120 days. The residential setting is not designed as a fix-all. I believe, and the belief is in the clinical world, that you want a kid to be in the least restrictive level of care possible. So you're in residential when you cannot function efficiently outside of residential. But once you can, you may still struggle with a lot of things. But once you can function in
Hmm.
an outside environment, then you would transition to a PHP or an IOP, day programs, things like that. And that's optimal. So on average, about 90 to 120 to get them stabilized to the point that they can try their skills in the outside world.
And how severe should a person be before someone would consider going to residential treatment?
You're asking a whole bunch of great questions. It's very nuanced. So it depends on what you're dealing with. So, for example, um, a kid may be able to maintain, from a therapeutic standpoint, they can deal with their depression with an outside therapist or their anxiety, but they're engaging in super high risk behaviors, right? Driving the car without permission, flipping the car, sneaking out the window, having sex with strangers, talking to random people on the internet. So if they can't be maintained safely and effectively in the outside environment, that might be a qualifying criteria. If they're home but they're depressed and they're anxious and a regular therapist can't handle enough because they're becoming suicidal or self-harming, that might be a qualification. If they're explosive at home and things get violent and the police have to be involved and they're not in school, that could be a qualification. So it's a mixture, especially with kids, more so than adults, of how strong is the mental health component, how strong are the other components, and the biggest question is, can this child function effectively in an environment outside of a residential setting? And if the answer to that question is they cannot right now, then residential makes sense. And the minute the answer is they can, then residential stops making sense.
Yeah, and I see that a lot where I've got a lot of university students as clients, and some of them I would say are pretty non-functional, and I would say maybe residential would be good for them. Maybe they're not usually suicidal, and so that's where it's like kind of a blurry line where it's difficult to clinically make that judgment. I think most therapists would agree though that if they have a high degree of suicidality and they are not functioning in life, that would be a good referral to residential treatment. But then there are these other cases too where maybe it's just a high degree of defiance or social deviance. I guess that's more of a sociological term, but um, they're just not getting along in the community, I guess is a nicer way of putting that. Maybe those would be good candidates for residential as well. And I know you mentioned substance abuse. You do a little bit of substance abuse work. So, what degree of substance abuse would warrant residential treatment?
So I'm going to answer your first question, just or statement. Um, in terms of behavioral, you're right about the ability to function within the community. The thing about teens versus adults is, at least from an insurance perspective, they view the adults as having free choice. And from the legal system, they view these adults as having free choice, even if they're extremely suffering. They imply that this is the choice that they are choosing to be this way. With kids under 18, they can't say that. These kids are minors. These kids are under their parents' support. And because they can't say that, and because you can hold a teenager against their will in a treatment center versus an adult who can just walk out, the behavioral type clients tend to end up being teens, and the behavioral adults end up, unfortunately, in a hospital or in jail or other things like that. Because again, they view the impetus for the issue differently, right? And the same thing with addiction. They say, look, a kid being an addict is because he's a kid. We need to get him help. If something happens, it's terrible. But an adult is choosing to use these drugs, right? They don't recognize them as the same thing. And so when we deal with substance use, especially as it pertains to teenagers, we also view things from a different lens. And it helps get rid of that whole idea that it's completely free choice to be an addict. Addiction is, in a large part, genetic, which people don't recognize. And addiction qualifies as a mental health disorder, which a lot of people don't recognize. Viewing it as a moral choice is antiquated at best. But with teenagers who don't have 10 years of alcohol, 5 years of heroin, 20 years of, marijuana, whatever it might be they're using, you really are dealing with an underlying mental health condition when you peel it back. And usually they're self-medicating to cover other things up. And so even though we treat addiction, we treat it from a mental health lens, which makes it just a little bit different.
I know a lot of wilderness therapy programs. Well, I mean, I guess it's a natural part of wilderness therapy to take away electronics. Is that something that you do too as part of the residential treatment? Like you remove electronics from the teen's life, or I mean, they might have some access to like email home or whatever. Like what do you think is best for that?
So you are correct. Cold turkey is the way to go with teenagers because oftentimes they connect with the same friends. They call for help. Kids will come in and hide drugs or other paraphernalia in the bushes. Their negative influences can reach out to them. Obviously, social media access, all that is not a good thing. It's kind of a culture shock when they show up. They have to hand in their wallet, their phone, their condoms. Like they assume it's going to be a party, a rehab party,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not that. So we do disconnect them from everything. You have email for school, right? You use the computer for school, but it is critical to separate them from all of that because, again, when you're looking at an issue, you have to look at the issue completely objectively and clear of all other issues. And having social media and all these other things can actually contribute to their mood changes and all the other things we're trying to address. So we really want to separate it nice and clean. Okay, now we're looking at a kid. Now what are we doing? Right now, what are our interventions? What is the diagnosis without it being muddled by all the other factors that exist in their home environment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that can be really difficult. And I'm not sure if there are any official withdrawal symptoms from electronics. So, I mean, we were talking about substances a minute ago, and that made my mind transition to just general addiction. Um, Obviously, we're also, if this is a problem for them, we're helping them abstain from sex addictions. Or what other addictions are there? Sugar addictions, or particular process addictions. Uh, do you know if there are like do people deal with withdrawals from things like that?
Good question. This is all relatively new. There are definitely some studies as to the impact. I can tell you from teenagers, the most obvious withdrawal is they become obnoxious
Mm,
and they become bored and they don't know how to fill their time and they become anxious and they become, a lot of parents use technology as a thing just to keep their kids entertained, right? I put them in front of the
yeah.
screen and not drive me crazy. Um, so to some extent, you see withdrawal in their behaviors. It's not the same withdrawal as like the physical withdrawal of like heroin or something, and you're not necessarily fiending for it like you might for other process addictions. Um, but certainly for teens, it's a big piece, and even adults, adults who are basically adolescents of an older age, who maybe never learned to be social and lived around a computer and they're gamers and that's their whole identity. And so removing them from that, can have a really big effect mentally, which then could look like withdrawal symptoms,
Hmm.
but it's also like, who am I now without my technology? And what am I? And where am I going? I'm so anxious. This is going to be miserable, right? These are all, a form of withdrawal, but not quite the withdrawal that you think of.
So kind of an identity crisis or emotional instability, at least on the temporary, until they can stabilize and become mindful with the present and learn that life is okay without these things.
Correct.
I wish as adults we could get away from these things too sometimes. And many of us do. Like we go hiking or camping on the weekends, but then at the same time, we've got our Monday through Friday jobs. and we've got all these demands, a lot of responsibilities, especially if we're parents or highly educated professionals. So, what would you recommend for the average adult who's having a hard time getting away from those things?
As you sort of highlighted, not every, like people consider therapy the what's the word, the benefit of the wealthy, so to speak, or something that, if you can afford the time to see a therapist, pay for a therapist, and take a time out of your day, that's a luxury. And it is true. Not a lot of people have that luxury. People have to work 9 to 5 or 9 to 9, or really, who have to work to survive. You don't really have the time or luxury of putting that down and going for a hike or doing any of the things we've talked about, even though they're important. Um, so there's kind of a twofold process to that. One is learning to do that while you're moving, right? So maybe if when you work 9 to 9, you're always on your phone, put it down for 10 minutes and read a book, right? There are ways you can do it within the context of your day. If you do have the luxury or ability to disconnect, then do that. I myself, I'm sort of in the middle. I have the ability to do that, but I'm a CEO of a company, and I'm getting calls and texts 24/7, to my wife's chagrin, so to speak. But I actually downloaded an app where you basically have to do a certain amount of push-ups or sit-ups or pull-ups to open your apps, which was pretty fascinating. But at some point, it became so annoying given the volume of things I needed to do that I just disconnected it. So I'm a bad example of what someone should do, but I definitely know that I would love to be that way if I could.
And I mentioned this on a recent episode, but my strategy is to have people switch their phones to grayscale, because at least if it's grayscale, you can still mostly do everything on your phone. It doesn't lock you out, but you get way less of a dopamine hit that way. It's much
That's pretty
much
cool.
more boring to the brain. And so typically when I have clients do that, as long as they keep it on grayscale, they report great success with it. But then occasionally, of course, I get that person who comes back and they're like, "Oh, it was just annoying, so I turned it back on color." The other
Yeah.
strategy, and I think I mentioned this on another episode before too, is if you've got an iPhone, there's the screen time settings, or I'm not sure what Android has. I'm sure they have something similar, but often when people turn on like the screen time limits, maybe it's you set your phone to limiting you to like 2 hours a day of screen time. I'm just throwing out a random number here,
No, no, understood.
and that notification pops up and says you've hit your limit for today. Most people will just manually override it and keep doing what they're doing. But I always
Right.
say it still has value because it's still making you think twice about your screen time. Where if you have that turned off, you're just going to go crazy with it. It's going to be so many more hours. You're not even going to be thinking it's too much. Well, Mendy, we are coming up on the end of our episode. If there is one thing that you think people could do to change the way they approach health and wellness, what do you think it should be?
Um, education, education. We assume we know everything. We get our information from all the wrong places. Taking a little bit of time to educate yourself, whether as a parent, educating yourself about the struggles your teen goes through, or about parenting as an adult, learning about depression and how that works, learning about how medications interact, learning about strategies to do different things, right? People shoot from the hip when the reality is there are professionals out there are books out there are well established principles out there's research out there. And so I recommend the number one thing you can do to help yourself or anybody else is to get educated. And with today's access to everything, it's really not that hard to
Yeah.
get educated. It's actually quite fascinating. I saw an article today that ChatGPT, functioning as a therapist and answering people's questions, has been rated higher than an actual therapist, which is kind of shocking. But you can you can get yourself educated utilizing almost any tactic out there, and it'll even do the research for you. Right? Give me some strategies for dealing with depression. What are some of the things people think about when they're trying to get a meal together? Technology's come a long way. So getting yourself educated, ask the right questions, getting strategies is the key really to everything, and consistency, obviously.
Yes, I love the education. I know historically, at least before the internet, people would rely on authority figures for education. And I mean, maybe books, but typically they were written by authority figures too, right? Nowadays, we've got the internet, we have access to so much more information. And I mean, I'm not saying it's all good information. I would even say most of it is not the best information. But
Sure.
I would encourage people to just consume this information with an open mind, think critically about it. Don't just trust everything you hear or everything you read, because you mentioned using ChatGPT. And I was like, I know a lot of people who are using that and they're relying on it right now. But as long as we can keep a critical mind, we can keep our sanity at the same time and glean the
Sure.
benefits from it. One last thing, if people wanted to work with you, how can they find you?
Mendi Baron, MENDIBARON.com.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much for being here, Mendi. It was great talking to you.
Likewise, thank you for your time.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you leave a review. That really helps me out. And also subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. Real Food Mental Health is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on this podcast is not intended to replace any medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. While I am a healthcare provider, I am not your provider. Always seek the advice of an appropriate healthcare practitioner with any personal questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. Reliance on information provided by this podcast is at your own risk.